And I would like to sort of bring us up to date a little bit after last week. We left with the question of how does one begin to think about architecture and urbanism as curating a city that is poised between a communitarian and a liberal sort of battle over the ethos for the city and for urban design, and particularly when that is also juxtaposed with a globalizing era in which multiculturalism seems to dominate our cities. Now today, Michael is going to begin to refine his arguments from last week by reference to three different scales that are all rather dear to him. That of the Thames Gateway and that of the borough of Tower Hamlets, where he's been politically involved for so many years, and also the area around Spitalfields and Bishopsgate, where some of the battles over the future of the city fringe have become most noticeable, most pointed. In all of these, the question emerges, how does one begin to think about the design of housing? How does one begin to think about the role of urbanism and urban design in shaping a politically responsible future? And so I'd like you again to welcome Michael Keith for about an hour's discussion, and 45 minutes maybe, and then we'll have questions and answers after that. Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to recap momentarily before moving forward, what I tried to lay out last week was a sense in which, following the Georges Perec quotes, sometimes in order to understand the city you need a compass rather than a map. And in doing that, what I was trying to suggest was that the tensions between the liberal and the communitarian that arise from taking culture seriously, and in particular that arise from taking multiculturalism seriously, need always to be thought of alongside the conventional understandings of kind of progressive or utopian urbanism and more straightforwardly capitalist forces of perhaps somewhat more reactionary understandings of city change and city transformation. Very, very simply, if you like, what I was trying to point towards is that there is a liberalism of the right and a liberalism of the left alongside a communitarianism of the right and a communitarianism of the left, and that we need to think through all 4 points of that compass in trying to understand the ways in which the city changes. And in particular, for the audience here at the AA, what I was trying to suggest that we are in a particular moment that is characterized by a changing nature of debate between planning and architecture. One of the things I was kind of pointing towards was a sense that certainly for myself, the dialogue between planning and architecture is frequently almost an oxymoronic notion. It almost seems to barely exist in many of the arenas in which I seem to be present, particularly intellectually. And what I was thirdly trying to say was that there's a particular sense, if we're going to understand the ways in which the city is changing, that we can't, in trying to kind of characterize how architects and planners might speak one to another, we cannot avoid the problems of liberal government. There isn't some heroic world beyond the boundaries of regulation. There is, and just to kind of point to a kind of literature that I was trying to highlight as problematic, but I didn't have time to go into enormous amount of detail. I think there is, in particular, a kind of a cosmopolitan planning literature associated with people like James Holston and Leonie Sandercock that I find deeply problematic, precisely because it creates a space in the city that is a space beyond government, a space beyond power. I think that's a kind of fundamentally flawed understanding of the way in which the city works and the way in which we all live our lives. It is not that I'm trying to valorize power or make power heroic. It's just that at a very banal level, I'm trying to kind of suggest a sense in which these regimes of power are in some ways actually profoundly banal, but we cannot escape the licensing laws, the planning edicts, the regulations of the economy, the regulations of everyday life, the ways in which we become an individual within a regulated community. And also then, finally, what I've tried to suggest is that at the moment, in the last few years, in London and elsewhere, what we're actually witnessing is a very real sense in which there is a return to the disciplines associated with various forms of social engineering. And what I mean by that quite specifically is that there is a sense in which we are not returning to a kind of Keynesian welfare state moment, but for various reasons. The attempt to envision other kinds of city is politically prominent. It's politically prominent in London through various new institutional forms, through the creation of a new London plan, but I think it is prominent transnationally as within moments of globalization, the kind of always fragile nature of the nation state looks increasingly parlous, and the ways of thinking urbanistically become an important way of imagining social futures as well as governing city spaces. So there is a real sense in which, I think after the heydays of the decades of the late 70s through the 80s and early 90s, when a sort of market liberalism kind of dominated the cities of the Western world, that there is, for reasons sometimes ecological, sometimes economistic, not necessarily particularly utopian, there is some kind of a return or an appeal to the disciplines that try and suggest that the city can be managed, can be shaped, can be controlled. And part of what I want to address today is the relevance of a very old question, David Harvey's almost oldest question of all in thinking about the urban, thinking about city studies, that we need to consider in whose image the city will be remade in some of these debates that attempt to shape, to control the urban. And what I want to try and do is to lay out in maybe a more straightforwardly schematic way today than last week, a sense in which my argument that the problem of multiculturalism will shape these notions of future cities through the dynamics of thinking about this metaphor of curating the city in a little bit more detail, and then trying to tease out exactly what this does mean at the three scales of analysis that Larry touched on in the introduction. First of all, the notion of London as a whole, and in particular a major region of London, the Thames Gateway. Secondly, in the context of a single borough. And thirdly, in the context of one fragment of that. And on each of these occasions, what I'm trying to do is not suggest that we can talk about a cartography of these scales as being unproblematic in any way. Just to refresh, one of the things I tried to introduce last week is that we need to be extremely suspicious about the ways in which the stories that use space and the stories that use time to make sense of the city have to be themselves subjected to particular kinds of scrutiny. And if that was where I ended up last week, my starting point, therefore, this week, is twofold. It's in debates around the urban renaissance, and it's in debates around this notion of curation. Precisely because what I'd like to get to by the end of the talk is beginning to get something of a sense of how debates around urban renaissance might be, in part, about restructuring this exchange within the technocratic disciplines of social engineering. That the urban renaissance might be, inadvertently or actually, reshaping the territory through which planners and architects engage one with another. And clearly, this is in the context, the shadow, if you like, of all sorts of policy debates around urban renaissance, going back to Richard Rogers' Reith lectures, going back to the Urban Task Force, the Urban White Paper, all of this I will take, if you like, as the shadow at the back of the mirror, and rather than talk about that, I will kind of hopefully assume that most of the audience are at least kind of reasonably aware of some of that context, and I will try and talk to it rather than about it. But to come back to the notion of curation, what I tried to suggest is that if we are to take bits of the city and consider the way they're presented slightly suspiciously, it might almost be in the sense in which Walter Benjamin takes the various fragments of the city as problematic in the ways in which they tell particular stories. And again, as partly as a digression, but in order to kind of try and give a sense of what interests me, there is, if you read the correspondence between Benjamin and Adorno, there's a time, particularly through the 20s, when Adorno is incredibly supportive of Benjamin, and they shared a kind of suspicion around the terms through which modernity was translated into cultural theory. They shared what we might understand as a kind of vaguely counterpastoral understanding of modernity itself. And one of the quotes that I used last week, I think, was that from Adorno's notion that history has no meaning in itself, but only in reference to the present, and only as a critical concept which demystifies the present. There's a sense in which both Adorno and Benjamin start out with this shared understanding that we need to be cautious about the ways in which chronology makes sense of the city, chronology of any sort. Hence they kind of tend to look towards a historiography rather than a history. And I remember I mentioned Benjamin's kind of quotation about being suspicious of history and its flashing its Scotland Yard credentials and so on. But what actually, through the late 20s and early 30s, as Benjamin struggles to complete this voluminous thing, the Arcades project, what begins to split them is a dispute, really, around the ways in which, I think, for me, at any rate, what Benjamin is partly trying to do is to say, just as we need to be suspicious of the manner in which narratives of the temporal make sense of the city, we need to be equally suspicious about the spatial ordering of things. And in fact, Adorno, particularly in the late 30s, as Benjamin increasingly fails in getting grants and getting jobs, he cautions against the ways in which Benjamin continues to try and disrupt a spatial ordering of things in the Arcades project. Tries to highlight the ways in which different regimes of representation produce different kinds of knowledges about the city. And Adorno kind of says reprovingly at one time in one of the letters, one might express it this way: the theological motif of calling things by their names has a tendency to reverse into an astonished presentation of simple facts. If one wished to speak very drastically, one could say that this study, the Arcades project he's talking about, has settled at the crossroads of magic and positivism. That spot is bewitched. Only theory could break the spell, your own determining good speculative theory. And in part, what I want to try and do over the next 45 minutes or so is to actually justify Benjamin's point when thinking through the curation of the urban, to kind of jump to the end before coming back a little bit. What I want to try to suggest to you is that, if we make the city visible through narratives of capitalism, that is a very powerful and important framing device. It is also very real in the ways in which it impacts upon communities, upon areas, upon the Ricardian rent curves that valorize property. But it provides a lens through which the city is made visible. If we think about the city as a space to live, a dwelling space, then that lens actually displaces, curates the city in a very different kind of way. If we think about the city as a site of various employment activities, as various economic drivers, again, we will find that the spatial ordering of the urban differs depending upon the lens which is worn at a particular moment. And in part, what I want to try and do is to suggest that these three scales of analysis do not sit babushka-like, one inside another, like the little Russian dolls, but instead reproduce exactly this problem about curation, that we need to think through the ways in which they are made visible as economic objects, as cultural objects, as lived spaces. And the ways in which these spaces are curated is extremely important in thinking about the kinds of knowledges that are brought to bear on those spaces, whether those knowledges are architectural, whether they are those of the estate agent, whether they are those of the urbanist, or those of the literary archivist. The point I'm trying to make is that unless we can begin to unpack the plurality of spaces present, we won't really begin to get to grips with the ways in which these spaces become subjected to the sorts of political change, political control that's at the heart of the two talks that I wanted to give here. So just to give you an example of what I mean, that there's a very straightforward sense that if we begin to think about London, which is where I'll confine my discussion to, but I would argue very strongly that London itself is no more than an exemplar of patterns and trends that are characteristic to even the most obscure parts of the globe today. That we might think about the spaces of the city in terms of multiculturalism through various forms of objective measure, but we know that there is an iconography that lies behind that objectivity. It was no coincidence that a few years ago, in 98, 99, the nail bomber chose as sites to attack in the most obscene way Brixton in South London, Brick Lane in the East End, and then Chinatown in Soho, but on his way to Chinatown stopped in that kind of signpost of other forms of cultural difference in the middle of a gay pub, and in each case left horrific nail bombs causing various degrees of destruction. The iconography of multiculturalism identifies very straightforwardly with a kind of common sense mapping of the city. But that kind of common sense mapping needs to be thought through in terms of other cartographies. What I'll come back to in just a second, but just to frame what I have to say, the three scales of analysis sit variously within the pie slice that's highlighted to the east of London there. The map's taken from the draft London plan and is reproduced in a fairly similar form in the current recently published final version of the plan itself. That the plan actually makes London visible as a site for future growth. And this may be right or this may be wrong, but I think the dominant metaphor that sits at the heart of the plan is a notion of an understanding of how London can and will grow. And I'll return to that in just a second. But the areas that I'm talking about are, first of all, that pie slice that go from the Tower Bridge eastwards to the boundaries of London and beyond. And then, secondly, the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, which sits in that teardrop in the River Thames, which bounds onto the River Lee, westwards to the City of London and the Square Mile. And then finally, in the context of the borders of the Square Mile, the City Corporation, and the East End itself. And if we actually try and make those areas visible, as I say, we need to think through the manner in which there is an appropriation of both languages of space and languages of time to make particular changes appear natural. This is not to kind of detract from this particular piece of work. It's just one example. One of the things that structures London's future is the ways in which we figure the city through sites of opportunity, through sites of change. And each of these forms of figuring themselves produce a kind of curation that we need to subject to a certain kind of scrutiny. As it happens, News International, the public face of Rupert Murdoch's press empire, has two major sites in London. One in the area of Wapping, near the Tower, which will feature later on in what I've got to say, which became the site of huge conflict in 83, 84, 85, when News International moved from Fleet Street, effectively tried to break Union power in Fleet Street in order to try and bring forward technological change on the site of Wapping, producing enormous protest on what was then a relatively cheap site for both the production of newspapers and journalism itself. And Murdoch's other big site in London is Convoy's Wharf, which is on the waterfront in Deptford, in Lewisham, which is where newsprint has always been brought in historically. Now, on both of these sites, over the last 15 to 20 years, the technological forms of production that generated their layout has increasingly become anachronistic. What that means is, very crudely, on the News International site in Wapping, it is very questionable whether or not it is necessary to produce newspapers there as well as having the journalism there. There is no necessary need to make, in classic economistic terms, conception and production as proximate one to the other as they have been historically on that site. So you have a piece of real estate that was effectively set up as a newspaper production site in the 1980s, in an area which through the 1980s and the 1990s, a period of 20 years, was subjected to enormous processes of gentrification, configuring the land value enormously high in Wapping and various semi-anachronistic forms of production on the site. And similarly, although not in quite as pronounced a form, in South London, the place where newsprint was brought in by boat to Convoy's Wharf has increasingly become restructured through various forms of technological change until the site itself became redundant a couple of years ago. So what has been going on over the last few years is a debate about the appropriate future of the Convoy's site. And I just want to kind of exemplify this to give you a taste of what I'm trying to suggest. But what you find is in the master plan, very crudely, I think in this case, that the local authority moved sensibly to introduce and begin a master planning process in anticipation of News International bringing forward plans for the site. So they turned to an architectural practice, which you might have just caught on the corner of the earlier slide, but turned to architectural practitioners to try and provide an appropriate future vision for the site itself. The point I would want to make, very straightforwardly and hopefully fairly simply in the context of what I was just saying, is that within the rhetorics of the master planning process, the location of convoys in London is established by virtue of various forms of proximity. It is adjacent to certain kinds of land use function. It's also the case that the future of the site is linked to the quasi-architectural, semi-architectural profession of urban design in terms of high-quality urban design framework. All of this, I don't say in any denigratory way, but equally importantly, in terms of what I'm trying to say, the site itself sits on the boundaries of the area that was at one stage the victualling yard for the Royal Navy, but also the dockyard for the East India Company. Just near this is where a Russian Tsar learnt to build boats a number of years ago. So the historical the historical traces of empire. This is actually just up from here is where Drake circumnavigated the world, where Raleigh lay down his cloak for Elizabeth in those kind of famous pictures. Almost the empire begins here in one very, very straightforward way. And the appeal to the historicity of this site features within the ways in which change is made normal. So in a very straightforward way, what I'm trying to suggest is that turns into a kind of a massing diagram. And what we begin to see is the ways in which, actually I'll come back to that, certain kinds of change are rendered normal through stories of the temporal and through stories of the spatial. If something fits in a chronology, if something fits in a configuration of space, then it becomes more acceptable. And this is the sorts of ways in which we need to think about this process of curation. We also need to think about the sorts of regimes of knowledge that become important in this process of curation. Most straightforwardly, the visual becomes much more important. Alongside the visual becoming more important, the aesthetic becomes more important. That there is a sense in which, and we may wish to kind of tease this out a little bit in discussion, that there is an aestheticization of the debate about city spaces and city change that you might see as diminishing a debate about the political framing of these same spaces. I think whether you see it that way or not, I think what is uncontestable is that precisely because the appropriation of stories of time and stories of space become ever more complex, we need to think about the sorts of discipline that are brought to bear on the regulation of these same spaces. This includes architecture, but clearly it also includes urban design. It also includes land use planning. It also includes notions of licensing. It also includes notions of ecological sustainability and a debate around environmental impact of these kinds of changes. There are all sorts of new kinds of knowledges that are brought to bear upon these spaces in the city. Architecture is just one of very many, I think, and there is a very real sense in which, in presenting the spaces as ripe for change, as appropriate to be changed, we need to unpack the manner in which the spatial and the temporal become resources in facilitating that change. What it also means is that it becomes important to think through how these narratives work in other parts of the city, in other parts of London. If I move to the first of the three levels of analysis I just want to talk through today, there is, within the figuring of London, many different ways through which the city can become visible as an object of government and as a site of change. The two examples I want to just contrast one with another today are the work that's been done by Jeff Mulgan for the Prime Minister's delivery unit, and the implicit changes that are suggested by Ken Livingstone's London plan, supported by the planners at the GLA, but also supported by the Architecture and Urbanism unit at the GLA. In terms of these two slightly different models, if you look at the ways in which Jeff Mulgan's London works, I thought about putting bringing along a whole load of slides, but what I would instead suggest to you is that you actually go through, if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about what I'm going to say, you have a look at the website of 10 Downing Street, and through there you can find the document that has never really been formally published, but is the subject of enormous political debate over the last 12 months or so. Because it's precisely because a sense of, and I mean, you'll see this in the newspapers over the last few weeks, a sense of the crisis of the economy of London and the sustainability of London's economy in the face of rotting infrastructure, in the face of dependence on certain economic sectors, in the face of escalating housing markets, in the face of an inability to provide public sector that works within London. All of these have created some of the dynamics that I was trying to touch on earlier on that are common to the cities of the world, but are common to the notion about how you can plan the future of the city, not just in land use planning terms, but in all the senses of the notion of the plan. And Mulgan's London, and for that matter, the London of Livingstone's newly adopted London plan, both assume an extraordinary scale of change in future years. One of the metaphors that's quite often used is the kind of new city, I touched on this last week, that will be fitted within London over the next 10 to 15 years in both Mulgan's London and Livingstone's London, if you like. There is a significant difference between the two, though, which is about the way in which that change will be adopted. If we think about the change from 91 to 2001 in the decennial census, London grew by somewhere between, and it's been revised upwards and downwards, and I can give you the figures exactly if you want, but I think it was stall the flow a bit. London grew by about 800 to 900,000 people. A phenomenal number, a very large proportion of which depended on flows of migration. Both in Mulgan's analysis of the future of London and in Livingstone's analysis of the future of London, predicated in the London plan, there is an assumption that London will continue to grow exponentially at a similar rate. Now, the evidence for so doing, I think, is moot, and exponential curves tend to be a predictor of nothing else other than a continuation of trends already demonstrated. And the growth from 91 to 2001 was very much counter the pattern from 1945 to 1990. That said, it is common to the global cities that London is often said to be equivalent to. It is predicated also on growth in certain economic sectors, and the model of London's growth may or may not prove accurate in the future. But it is important to understand that as a model of growth, it predicts population numbers that at each of the scales of analysis I want to talk through are not exceptional in terms of historical precedent, precisely because London's suburbanized from the World War II onwards. The sorts of numbers that I'm going to be talking through at each scale of analysis is actually a scale that is precedented, in the sense that London's population has declined. The growth from 91 to 2001 has still not taken it back to the population it once was. But the point I would want to stress is that the source of that population is largely, that population change, is largely predicted to be future migration, a debate that's only become live in recent weeks in the city. There is a very real sense in which the kinds of population migration that are at the heart of London's change have been partly obscured by the fact that from 91 to 2001, again the figures will be slightly wrong, but that of the order of 40 to 50% of that migration can be accounted for by white, old Commonwealth and American flows of skilled labour. So the flows of migration that become visible and those flows of migration that are not rendered visible are themselves not without problem. But the point I'd want to make, most importantly, is that when you begin to unpack these slightly different versions of how the city might change, what Jeff Mulgan's analysis does is think of London in a way that is largely cartographically non-specific. What I mean by that is it takes the economy as various forms of employment. And it has areas that it thinks will grow, areas that it thinks will not grow. It, through all sorts of indicators that you might care to choose, Mulgan's London is in many ways a place with very little notion of a space economy. In contrast, Livingston's London plan has, I think, a slightly basic understanding of the space economy of London. In particular, what it does is, if you think of the slide that was up there earlier on, it takes London as almost the equivalent of a dental negative. You know, the carious spaces of your mouth are equivalent to the carious spaces of London's fabric. Those areas that show as brownfield or derelict or subject to change become identified in London's plan as the sites through which change may be realised. Now, again, the point I'd like to make is that both of these models, I'm not trying to say one is straightforwardly preferable to another, both of them involve various kinds of curation of the spaces of the city as a whole. There is a very real sense in which, within London's future, if London is to accommodate a city of the size of Leeds in its boundaries over the next 10 to 15 years, we need to think about the sorts of housing change that will be possible to accommodate that change. And very crudely, what emerges, implicitly or explicitly, are some very different understandings of how the Thames Gateway in particular will change. Mulgan's London basically sees the possibility of the inner suburban ring of London densifying through natural market forces. The fact that only 2 or 3 private home builders actually operate within London now, because it is seen as so difficult to work within, is kind of not really thought through in Mulgan's report on London. Instead, the government have produced something that's known as the Barker Report, which I have deep problems with for reasons I'm happy to explain, but which actually tries to identify, among other things, the suboptimal ways in which London's institutions work as a prime cause for preventing private sector investment in the housing stock in London. Now, I have problems with that for reasons that, if people want to, you can come back to in the discussion, but the point I would want to make is that the way that the Mulgan model works is that you assume London's economy grows on the basis of trend, you assume that economy turns into jobs, you assume the jobs are filled by population, and you assume the city will accommodate change. In contrast, I think at least the advantages of the narrative that emerges from the London plan is one that at least tries to unpick the space economy of that change. And in part, what it tries to suggest is it tries to translate the sorts of change that people are talking about into sites on the ground through this metaphor of caries, if you like, through this metaphor of these brownfield sites that need to be developed within a rhetoric of urban renaissance. It is a notion, and again, I'm afraid I'm skipping through quite a lot of material fairly fast, but I think that the intellectual underpinning of the London plan are precisely the principles, what is good and what is bad, for that matter, about the Urban White Paper and the Urban Commission. It is taking a notion that you need to have high quality density development on old industrial land in order to generate large scale housing targets across the city as a whole. There are 2 points that I want to make there about what this means for how we think about that future. And then I just want to kind of lead on to what this means maybe for thinking architecturally about that future. The first of these is that both of these models, either by thinking of London as a whole in a fairly kind of loose way, as the Mulgan report does, or by trying to target specific sites, you produce a map, a cartography, which privileges the spatial, sometimes at the cost of the temporal. This has very direct results. At its most, and again, I think you have to, if you can bear with me with this, there is a debate about whether or not the gateway of London should accommodate somewhere between 60,000 new homes or 100,000 new homes or 200,000 new homes. And the way that this debate arises is by taking those patches of land and attributing to each of them in turn a quantum of houses that might be developed, either by social landlords as social housing or by private developers. And what this ends up doing is a kind of almost leading to an angels on a pinhead debate about what sorts of numbers are realistic or are plausible at a particular moment. What that then leads to, very straightforwardly, is what I want to call the Thames Gateway paradox. Because what you can produce very, very straightforwardly is a sense in which it is quite possible to produce on old brownfield industrial employment land by changing the governance framework of it, by changing the land use planning regulations, large sites for new housing, either by big social landlords or by private developers, and produce quite large numbers of new homes over the next 10 to 15 years, relatively reasonably. What that means is that you can produce a model of the Thames Gateway that will produce housing numbers at a scale that is not as ambitious as the London plan might aspire to, but at a cost which does not demand major investment in physical infrastructure, that does not demand as major investment in social infrastructure, precisely because the numbers are themselves lower. However, what goes on is that in order to try and prove the importance of London, people try and talk up the numbers that are necessary in the Gateway. So if London is the only region of Britain's economy that is effectively in surplus, which it is, then the importance of London, what Tony Blair has done is he's established a cabinet committee called MISC 22 to see through the future of this Mulgan report. What he's actually done is produce a sense which, if you like, the future of the British economy depends upon the future of the space economy of London itself. Now, if you then begin to up the ante and try and suggest that you need much higher numbers, what you produce is a model of the Thames Gateway where you need to have much higher numbers of housing change over your same short, truncated time period. And that generates a series of costs, not least around things that you'll all have heard of around Crossrail, around doctrines like rail extensions, around various forms of new hospitals grown, around new roads. The kind of physical and social infrastructure begins to escalate 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion, 40 billion. So if you produce both a truncated version of time and a realistic understanding of urban renaissance, you produce massive costs, which immediately leads, almost inevitably, to a debate about whether or not the cost of making the Thames Gateway happen is valuable. And the point that I'd want to make is that this produces a very simple but paradoxical understanding of how change might happen. That if you actually considered the principles of urban renaissance and thought through density in its most powerful sense, then it would actually be possible to generate your very large, ambitious numbers across the whole of the Thames Gateway, across varying registers of time. But by extending your targets of change over time, your annual costs diminish. If you actually crush your targets into smaller amounts of time, your infrastructure costs escalate. The point about the paradox is that it is, on one level, easier to aspire to a kind of a suburbanized version of the Thames Gateway on the one hand, or an over-ambitious version of the Gateway on the other hand. But unless you understand the temporalization, the ways in which time itself becomes a commodity, you cannot think through the ways in which those spaces may or may not accommodate optimal numbers of change. The point being that I'd want to make is that what we might aspire to is a higher quality of city. If we actually really begin to have faith in the social engineering point, the political point I'd want to make is that it kind of doesn't matter whether this takes 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. I personally think we're probably talking about 50 years around the gateway or so, instead of the kind of timetables people talk. If you talk realistically, if you compare the gateway with Pudong in Shanghai and think about the ways in which the planning framework for change is put in place there is a real sense in which the economics of time actually facilitate a densification of space. And what that means, I think, is twofold in terms of both the discipline of architecture, but also in terms of the ways in which we think about multicultural London. A couple of important things flow. One is that across this big pie slice of London, you're talking through the building of what is called sustainable communities in the kind of the jargon of our times. But if we are to have new communities to the east of London, what that crudely means is about places in the old industrial manufacturing parts of London accommodating new communities of migration, both from inner London and from outside the United Kingdom. You are talking about a fundamentally multicultural new city across eastern London. This resonates in things like what has been adopted in London is that allocation processes to social housing, which have hitherto always worked within a borough, within one of the 32 boroughs of London, are now going to be tied at a sub-regional level. So what that means is Bangladeshi families from Whitechapel, African Caribbean families from Dalston will be offered housing in Havering, in Barking, in places where effectively we will have the suburbanisation of racial difference through processes of housing allocation. And if we fail to think through what the dynamics of that mean, in terms of just the very basics of survival, in terms of the very basics of how we build communities, we will create extraordinary problems. And in architectural terms, what this means is it's almost a return to kind of Weimar Frankfurt and the kind of debates that surrounded Ernst May and the provision of new forms of mass social housing and how that fits within a particular regime of social democratic capitalism. And so what I want to try and suggest is that we need to at least begin to think through the debates around the mass production of the homely without kind of leading too quickly. I mean, Adorno makes the point that we have an obligation not to be homely in our homes precisely because of the ways in which the new communities that might be built to the east of London will or will not reproduce. If you look at the rhetoric in the London plan, it talks about this kind of growth, these sorts of new residents, being epitomised by forms of urban villages. Precisely the sorts of change that kind of echoes a communitarian logic that I was trying to speak against when I was talking last week. If we also begin to think through what this means at a level down, then each of the boroughs in turn that sit within the Thames Gateway have to provide a notion of change that in a sense is politically congruent with those within that larger planning structure. What it means very straightforwardly is that within each of the boroughs in turn there is an obligation to think through the dynamics of city change. For Tower Hamlets, the borough that I represent, that translates into something like 40,000 new homes over the next 15 to 20 years. 40,000 new homes, a population of maybe getting on for twice that or more in terms of numbers. And very straightforwardly, what I want to suggest is that we can think through this in terms of slightly different narratives. You can think through this as potentially a political aspiration to gentrify the borough, something that I find deeply objectionable. That you have a concentration of large numbers of working class and broke communities in London, exemplified by boroughs such as the London borough of Tower Hamlets. And one of the easy ways that you create this notion of urban regeneration or city change is to just displace poor folk and create sites of new residents. Alternatively, and this is what I want to kind of begin to move towards in the last 10-15 minutes of what I've got to say, we might begin to think instead about the ways in which a dialogue between planning and architecture creates the spaces of the city as problematic, as a problem that through which three-dimensional space curates the temporalities of change. And what I mean by that is that across the borough as a whole, without going into kind of really slightly anorak detail, the ways in which the planning framework operate are changing legislatively at the moment. But there will be an obligation on the borough to find some way to accommodate the sort of change that is envisioned by national government and by regional government. Now, the way to react to that, I think, might be through kind of one of two metaphors. You can either try and fight that change, or I would suggest, in some sort of democratic framing, try and appropriate that change or steer that change to a model that actually maximizes the opportunities of developing the kind of city, the kind of multicultural city that we might aspire to in terms of the sorts of things I was talking through last week. Specifically, what will occur in London Borough of Tower Hamlets is that there are three areas of major change identified. There is an area around the Lower Lee Valley, which is where the current Olympics development is going to be. There's an area on the Isle of Dogs, and there's an area in the city fringe. I'll say a little bit more about the city fringe in just a second, but what I want to start with is just how we might figure those other two areas. That there is, in the Lower Lee Valley, this was the part of London that used to be almost the old metal bashing. It was kind of the Birmingham of London historically. And there are still certain kinds of old employment use there. There is a debate about what happens if the Olympics were to occur. But I think much more importantly, there is a live debate about how you might consider the future of that part of the city. The way this translates, and similarly on the Isle of Dogs, where you have a growth, as I was saying last week, a growth from no jobs in the financial services 20 years or so ago to a situation where currently there are upwards of 100,000 jobs. With the build-out of Canary Wharf alone, you're talking about a development which will accommodate 150,000 workers, and where on the Isle of Dogs as a whole, the kind of commercial development that is emerging will create a space for a workforce of 250,000 people. Now, there is a sense in which there is a narrative that would tell that story, which would produce an understanding of those workers in that new financial district as being incomers into the borough, potentially displacing poor folk locally, providing no benefits for the local community. Unfortunately, I actually did I won't go into today, but if you actually look at the details of the change that occurs, whether we like it or not, that the kinds of employment that are generated in a scale of development that size are actually quite complex, which means that there are increasingly large numbers of jobs that are accessed by local people. What that produces, therefore, is a sense in which part of the debate becomes a debate about how you integrate that scale of economic change into the city fabric immediately adjacent to the development of that new financial district itself. And in turn, what that becomes is a debate about the sorts of scale of change that are permitted within that zone of change and the scale of change that is prohibited. It turns into a debate about tall buildings. It turns into a debate about how planning obligations work and how local authorities as regulators get into a long-standing bargaining process by which the impact of city transformation needs to be mitigated. Again, I'm not quite sure, I don't want to get kind of too anorak-ish about it, but there is an obligation within British law, as I'm sure most people in the audience are aware, there is an obligation for major developments to demonstrate that they are mitigating the impacts that they generate. And in the negotiations around how you quantify that mitigation, there has become an increasingly sophisticated process across London in particular of how you negotiate those obligations in terms of the quantum of money that is paid for by developers, in terms of the quantum of social housing that is brought forward alongside private housing, that is about the quality of open space, the quality of the public realm, the quality of urban design. All of these become wrapped up in a debate about the kinds of urbanism we might wish to see coming forward in spaces that witnessing change in the present and will witness change in the future. Now it is possible to narrate this as a story of a clash between capital interests and public need. The problem about that sort of narrative is that I personally think that if you want to understand the logics of property capital, for what it's worth, I remain broadly kind of Marxian in the perspective I would take. You know, there is a kind of predictability about the ways in which property capital serves its own interests. But what that does not do is provide an understanding of the ways in which structures of government, local communities, democratic institutions, architects, planners, and other professions might work within that framework to generate the kinds of city, the kinds of urbanism that we would see as resolving some of the contradictions between the maximization of profit, which is straightforwardly the goal of the public limited companies producing either private office space or private housing, and the maximization of the public good that is implicit in the notion of building the good city. The point I try and make is that increasingly, in determining this process, the notion of the master plan becomes a significant factor through which architectural practices are brought to bear on providing the kinds of resolution to what happens on the Isle of Dogs, or the kinds of resolution of what happens in the Lower Lee Valley. And what I would want to say is that I don't necessarily believe that this is either a good thing or a bad thing, straightforwardly. But what I do suggest is that it becomes important to think through the sorts of knowledge that are produced by the architectural master planning of these areas that are being changed. What I would want to suggest is that the master plan itself is in some ways a departure from the conventions of land use planning. It is part of a dialogue that privileges the architectural, it privileges the visual, and in some sense it aestheticizes the spaces of the city itself. Now, none of these things are necessarily wrong. What I'm trying to suggest, though, is that the ways in which these spaces are made visible as sites of change is highly political. It is also the case that if we move on to the city fringe itself, which is the area where, if you like, the city corporation bumps into the boroughs immediately proximate to it, but particularly the boroughs of Camden, Islington, Hackney and Tower Hamlets, there is an extraordinary way in which this area itself is curated very differently, and some of the discussion at the end of the last talk kind of hinted at this. It is possible to see this area as, and I think that there are some interests within the square mile itself that would see this area as the hinterland of the financial district of the city corporation. Now that narrative makes the spaces of the city fringe visible as opportunity sites dependent on the city for their future. It is equally possible to see that area, that area where poverty meets affluence, as made visible through a narrative of this kind of changing same of assimilation. What I touched on last week was particularly the East End is frequently described as almost an Ellis Island of London itself. It is a place where migration has come and from which people have moved on. It is possible to make that area visible as a site through which the community resists change. The community, that communitarian politics visible both in its right-wing and its left-wing forms, in forms of a fight against the interests of property capital, but sometimes also visible in an assertion of certain kinds of community-based values. So the ways in which we make this area visible as a site of political contest becomes absolutely crucial to the ways in which we think about how we might manage its future through a debate around contemporary urbanism. If you take the space itself, it can also be made visible, I think, to be honest, almost scandalously, in terms of a kind of fragmentation of the city that takes a piece of the city fringe and asks, in a technocratic language that appeals to architecture and urban planning, how does this fragment sit within a larger whole? The Architecture Foundation produced a debate about 4 or 5 years ago that was displayed in Butler's Wharf in the Design Museum about the future of Bishopsgate Goods Yard. A highly architecturally framed debate that almost tried, in a way very similar to that Convoy's Wharf exercise I gave to you before, to ask people to invent a new piece of city. You can take that area and applying that metaphor of dental caries to the area that borders Tower Hamlets and the City Corporation, you can identify in red a whole series of sites. And on the bottom right-hand corner of this, you have just here, you have the area where Murdoch's print works run onto the back of the old tobacco dock site. And as Murdoch potentially moves out of that site, the old tobacco dock site that Gerald Ratner, after failing to sell any jewellery, now this kind of part-time job looks after, you would open up, again, an enormous development site. There are various other sites, Aldgate Roundabout, Bishopsgate Goods Yard we'll come back to in just a second, but it is possible to make this area visible as a cluster of different development opportunities. And I think if you do that, it privileges a certain kind of interest. If you actually make it visible on a site-by-site basis, you can take, that's the old Bishopsgate Goods Yard, where in recent political debates, that there was a sense in which central government in particular, I think, made that site visible through an imperative of creating the East London line, demanding the demolition of the site, I think actually unreasonably early, and actually foreclosing other debates about the possible future of the site itself. But the point I'd want to make is that each of these narratives, the one that juxtaposes heroic community against property capital, or privileges the needs of transport access through London. After all, London Borough of Hackney, that scandalously does not have a single tube stop, was one of the biggest lobbyists to try and achieve the demolition of the Bishopsgate Goods Yard site, because that was the only way they were promised a new East London line. But in other words, by privileging certain ways of seeing the spaces of the city, you imply certain kinds of things about the ways in which the city itself changes. The urban Renaissance rhetoric then turning into the kind of the isolation of the site from its surrounding area. And what I want to try and suggest is that just as a debate about dwelling and homes at the regional level turns into a series of architectural conceits and debates about the ways in which visual knowledges are produced in the master plan, we need also to think about the generation of the site in architectural language, precisely because it cannot be separated from other discourses of urbanism. Land use planning is one, but a whole series of other knowledges and contexts become very important in trying to figure this space as problematic. And as problematic in ways in which the metaphor of the city moving eastwards may be helpful at times, but not at other times. When I was trying to think about what I'd say about the city fringe, I was reminded somebody who was much more sensible than me and didn't take a job as an academic, who's a friend of mine now, who's got enough money to own somewhere in Venice, and they have a small palace. I think they're the third owner since the last 400 years. They have a small place on the border of the canal in Venice, and they a very enterprising sort of person, and they thought they could work out that they could actually protect. The problem with this little palace is that, of course, it floods a lot. So after buying this palace for an awful lot of money, this person created a whole new anti-flooding mechanism around his own grounds. When I saw him when I was giving a paper at a conference in the summer, and he said to me kind of in a very wry way that he thought that all this was going to work fantastically until the first flood had happened, and his defences, Maginot Line style, worked absolutely fantastically. But the flood actually came up from inside the landward side of the flood borders. And in a sense, I mean, the kind of boundaries of capitalism kind of seem likewise, that you create an offers dike, potentially, when you think through the metaphor of capitalism spreading spatially eastwards from the city, but only to see that, in fact, what we find within the areas around this part of London, the commodification process works through house-by-house gentrification. The commodification process works through the ways in which the area becomes exoticized as Banglatown, and ethnic difference itself becomes a commodity, and the area becomes visible as a site of the consumption of ethnic difference, commodified itself. So the ways in which capitalism works in the spaces of this city are more than through some sort of kind of frontier-like metaphor. What instead I want to try and suggest to conclude is that we need, and I've written a little bit about this in a piece that's in the AA files that's produced, is that we might need to think about the sorts of engagement between new forms of political subjectivity that emerge through multiculturalism and architectural practices and the changing nature of the city itself. What I tried to argue in the lecture last week was that we cannot simply base an understanding of the multicultural city on a naive appeal to community difference and to the heroics of community. In fact, one of the things that I try to suggest is that the forces of globalization might make us think differently about notions of nativity, about notions of citizenship, about notions of the city itself. And I want to close by a project that I think exemplifies the sorts of changing thinking that I believe becomes important in refiguring the urban and refiguring urban change in the way in which I was touching on it earlier on. Because in the piece itself that you can read, I try and suggest that one of the ways of thinking differently about living in the city is by thinking through how multicultural subjectivity might emerge differently in a globalized city from the ways in which we have conventionally thought about it. And the example I gave actually is based partly on the work of Giorgio Agamben, who has actually tried to suggest that it is important to try and derive new forms of categories to understand the politics of the global city in particular. And he actually draws on the work of Hannah Arendt in her essay excuse me, on the refugee, and to try and suggest that in order to understand the political community, we need to think through the ways in which political subjects become visible at some times and some moments, but not at others. What that does mean, quite specifically, is that in the case of this project that almost took place in Southall, there was a sense in which the architectural practice, Penoy and Prasad, were trying to work with a black and minority ethnic housing association, the Azra Housing Association, and the monitoring group in Southall, to think through how it might be possible to produce a centre for the victims of racial harassment. This was a centre that was to be built within Southall itself, but it was a centre which was highly contentious, highly politically contested, precisely because its visibility in this space of the city was seen to be something that was objectionable to various forms of community interest. That notion of the right-wing communitarian politics that I was touching on earlier on was articulated through languages about heritage, about normality, about the space of Southall as being a space that was needed for certain kinds of residential use. One of the things that was present, though, was that the monitoring group, who have been involved in a whole series of campaigns dating back to the death of Blair Peach and beyond, in the 1970s, conventionally around a fairly standard racial politics, but increasingly through a more sophisticated language of diasporic multiculturalism, thinking through. So the monitoring group have been involved in debates in London about the ways in which BJP politics translates into a community change in parts of the subcontinental India and in parts of London at one and the same time, and how this turns into a rhetoric of voluntary sector and community activity at particular moments of time demands a sense of the glocal, a sense of the ways in which global processes are locally realised. In the context of the particular centre that Azra and TMG and Penoy and Prasad were trying to produce, develop, there was a notion that what drove the process at its start was a sense that within Southall there was both a long-standing tradition of fighting against racial harassment and a long-standing need of providing housing for people who had become victims of that harassment itself. And building on the metaphor of the refuge and drawing from the women's refuge movement, the initial idea was to try and create a refuge, a site that was hidden within the fabric of the city itself. And in debating this, one of the things that emerged was precisely around how this itself might become problematic. The problem of urbanism itself was about the ways in which the landscape might conceal this sort of change as much as it would demonstrate it. The point being that the metaphor that in the paper actually I talked a little bit about the ways in which Stalker, the architectural practice, used similarly the work of Agamben, and the metaphor that informed these first sketch drawings of the centre itself was one of the flying carpet, so that rather than the city becoming the mechanisms through which a centre for racial harassment was hidden, the centre itself would actually demonstrate its presence within the city landscape by creating a structure that made the city visible to the victims of racial harassment as much as the victims invisible to the city itself. And so drawing on quite sophisticated plans by which the centre would not only become a conventionally defined site in which individuals that were subjected to racial harassment came into the centre through community networks and were reproducing conventional understandings of community politics in the centre itself, that it was also a debate about how it would extend into a debate about how victims of racial harassment were not merely in the streets of London and in Britain itself, but there was a ways in which you could capture the politics of the asylum seeker and the refuge more generally in terms of an understanding of racial harassment. The point I'd want to make is that, if you like, the metaphor of the magic carpet produces a much more complicated understanding of how an architecture of multiculture feeds into a subjectivity of ethnic difference within the changing landscape of the city itself. In other words, precisely the ways in which you curate this space, that you display this space, might actually open up a different kind of politics, different kinds of alliances. And that in that sense, it would mean that we might wish to think through the city as a whole in terms of the pluralities through which the whole city comes to work, through a problem of urbanism, an understanding of urbanism, if you like, as a problematic that architecture provides one discursive resolution to that problematization. But it is one discursive resolution among many. And it is part and parcel of what I wanted to conclude, that there is a suggestion that as the profession of architecture changes institutionally through its empowerment in different forms of government endorsement, we need to think alongside it of the other disciplines that are drawing on the visual ordering of the city and the curation of city spaces in order to think through what kind of city we would want to create. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for such a long and detailed presentation. And now I'm wishing that we had the 4 sessions that we originally had planned. It would have been very nice to have the opportunity to detail some of these even greater than you have been, most especially because I think we've now raised several issues here that it would be delightful to talk about for some time. Now, we have a little bit of time, perhaps 20 minutes or so for questions. Are there any from the audience now? Katerina.
I just wanted to know maybe a bit more in detail where you see the potential of the practice of architecture in the multiplication of forms of urban processes. I'm not sure if I quite, it wasn't much to get to me anyway, so I might have misunderstood you, but the last example you showed, it worked quite strongly on the level of metaphor.
Mm.
Or was the urban carpet also to be understood in terms of the spatial components?
I mean, the easy question first is, I mean, the design was one that flipped around the politics of visibility, so that the idea was, in architectural terms, you would actually combine an Indian roof garden with a fairly sophisticated understanding of who was looking at whom within that structure, so that as part of the refuge, that the victims of harassment would have a view from on high, looking down at the city, but also that there would be a resource which created a kind of sanctuary aspect to the design itself, so that it was the design itself was consciously hybridized between different forms of architectural vernacular, but it contained within itself a politics which was about making visible a refuge presence in the city, but also troubling an understanding of the refuge in terms of a debate around the refugee and the asylum seeker as part and parcel about, because one of the debates that informed that change was exactly who would or would not be eligible for the accommodation that was present in the site itself. One of the things that then developed was that notion of entitlement then turns into a debate effectively around citizenship, which turns into a debate around identity politics, which turns into a debate around the ways in which you can accommodate difference within the fabric of the city. So in terms of the easy question, there was a very real sense, I'm sorry if it was probably poorly explained, in which I think that the very opening up of the categories of entitlement and the categories of design begin to create a new sense of urbanism within one space of contemporary Southall. In terms of what I was trying to suggest in the kind of three scales of analysis, what the point that I was trying to make was that it's not that you could see the exercise of technocratic discipline upon space or time in the city straightforwardly, but that instead both architectural practice and other practices, including land use planning, open up different kinds of futures depending on the ways in which you configure the temporal and the spatial. So I think in part it's about trying to suggest that there are many more opportunities that emerge through the ways in which we problematize the bits of the city that are subjected to architectural practice, or the bits of the city that are subjected to land use planning. And what that means, I think, is that there are many more alternatives about the sorts of, I mean, you could say that this is a kind of, if you wanted to be negative about it, it's a kind of a politics of Faust, that there is a kind of a meta-narrative of change through which you sell your soul to the change at a certain price, and you're just negotiating what price you sell your soul at. But in part, what I was trying to suggest is that there's something a little bit more interesting going on in terms of the sorts of future that might open up in the city, depending on how you make those spaces visible through different regimes of the temporal, if that's not too pompous a way of putting it. Can say again? Can spaces? Through.
Do you mind if I elaborate that question a little bit? No. Apologies for that, but if we can put it perhaps in the language of some of what we've been developing through one of the courses of critical urbanism. In the 70s, you get a turn toward, let's say, through the book Learning from Las Vegas, a more semiotic approach to what is architecture doing. And I think, in a sense, Katarina's first question is this architecture that you're describing doing something other than by being semiotic? And is there a way for us to think about architecture as producing a spatiality within urbanism that is itself also political, or is that always merely functional from your point of view? Can we begin to look for an architecture that relates to the politics you're describing in any way other than through its ability to visualize almost metaphorically a kind of politics that is then defined through a different discourse? Let's say a discourse about racism, or a discourse about harassment, or a discourse about inequality or multiculturalism.
I'll try and answer that, and I'll probably do so inadequately. But I mean, taking from the semiotic forwards, if you take that Learning from Las Vegas semiotic moment, then the point that I'd want to move against is a privileging of design, signaling certain kinds of meaning in that kind of semiotic metaphor, precisely because I think what's potentially at stake are, and this is the point I was trying to make really about the gateway as a whole, that there is a very easy kind of liberal-based future for the whole of Eastern London, which is about crudely creating a low-quality, low aspiration, poor outcome piece of city through the old industrial bits and pieces of the contemporary city. What that would mean would be that implies certain kinds of governmental imperatives, as well as certain kinds of architectural practice and certain kinds of other exercise of power. The point I was trying to open up, in a sense, is that if we accept the plurality of the spatial, so rather than the space being singular, and this comes back to your point about spatiality, that the capacity for the spatial to contain many different futures within it, for the spatial to be actually realized over very different kinds of timescales, then we actually begin to unpack different sorts of futures for what might occur, not least in the very, going back into the heart of contemporary capital itself. So, a fragment of land is worth, if you take the kind of conventional Marxian political economy of the city, then rather than think in terms of a two-dimensional Ricardian rent curve that would determine value, part of what value is generated by is the three-dimensionality of the space itself, but also the governmental powers that allow you to structure the commodification of the air above the land. So that it is quite possible to begin to imagine that the ways in which that even within a political economic discourse, the commodity of land has many different futures attributed to it through the disciplines of planning and architecture. And in that way, even within a lexicon purely of the spatial for a moment, you immediately open up very many different kinds of scenario for any singular site, which I would hope anyway, is part of a move beyond the semiotic towards an understanding of the urban as generating certain sorts of problematic that are addressed through these technocratic disciplines. And then when you add into that as well, and this is the point about the curation, that the realization of these forms of change may occur again on different kinds of timescale, part of which are within the control of regimes of power and government and part of which are not, but none of which exist completely free of those regimes of power. That land use zoning works in a particular kind of way at a particular kind of time, even in its absence. If you take even the kind of the edge cities of the states, that there is an implicit process of commodification of land that is tied to regimes of governmental power, that it says something about the temporal. So the point I was trying to make is that if we begin to unpack the ways in which space and time pluralize, that is the way in which it kind of opens up the sense in which the spatial makes visible very different kinds of city through a critical understanding of the fact that we are not talking about a political economy free of governmental power. But is that sort of an answer? Maybe not.
We might have to come back to the question of what is the spatial. But other questions? Hugo. You were first.
If we want to try and avoid the sort of oversimplification that I agree with in the way that you described how these things tend to get both...
Hugo, could you talk up, please? Talk with your audience.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Can't hear you.
Maybe the microphone. We want to avoid the oversimplifications which Michael's been illustrating very well about the way the different possibilities are articulated, different scenarios are presented with a privileging of certain types of skills and of certain political and economic agendas. That implies that in order to curate other narratives and other ways of imagining how processes of change can work, we'll need a huge amount of effort by different actors, some of which are already very powerful in the process, needing to change their opinions about how things could be thought of, and also the empowering of others who at the moment find it extremely difficult to get any voice in thinking about how change could be curated in their area or in the city as a whole. Have you ideas about the sort of tools that could be used? For example, when you were talking about the Isle of Dogs and the huge processes of change there, and you referred to negotiations and so on, you didn't actually use the word planning gain, but a tool that is often used is a process, a fairly formal process within planning law to attempt to make a negotiation that there will be some sort of redistribution of the benefits or the value of change to people who wouldn't otherwise benefit from it. But it's a very crude tool which is easily, normally manipulated or avoided by those who really have strong power in the game. Are there other ways in which the sort of voice and the different identities and the different sorts of agendas that need to be much more clearly expressed when decisions are being made can be curated, and if so, who could do it? Is it curated through a local government, through academics, through the architect or other professionals saying, we need to pay attention to these other things? As in your last example, clearly the architect was trying to work very closely with a richer idea, a richer interpretation of what might be possible in the project. But it seems that there's a terrible problem in terms of how we would get to a richer, better curated series of interlocking narratives about how change could work much better. We tend to go back to very simple standoffs between certain powers again and again.
But you see, if the starting point is that there is no... actually, I'll start somewhere. If we start on the Isle of Dogs for a second, I think across London, the planning gain process has become increasingly sophisticated within communities on the ground, so that there is a sense in which, at its most crude, some very smart community agencies, for reasons that I have complete sympathy with and would defend on a certain level, are engaged themselves in quite sophisticated debates about what is their, at its most crude, what is their bung, what is it that they get from the process of planning change. And that there is a way, as these things kind of in a mimetic fashion work, that immediately becomes potentially appropriated by some of the more sophisticated developers, so that they make sure that this notion of, planning gain itself is meant to be, I'm always, when I'm wearing my politician's hat, cautioned that we shouldn't even use the term planning gain, precisely because the language of mitigation is the language in which the law is enshrined, and so that the language of planning gain turns into almost the language of moral bribery. I hasten to add, not necessarily anything more than that, but it becomes a debate about who sells out when, for how much. But what I would want to suggest, though, that what that means is that whichever way you look at that, is that you have discussions around power mediated by structures of government and regulation. So people are allowed to negotiate for some things, but are not allowed to negotiate for others. Now, what that means, in turn, is that there are all sorts of sophisticated ways in which those regulations may potentially work differently. One of the things that's being looked at the moment is if you look at the ways in which infrastructure change uplifts the value of land, then it might be possible to have a fairly sophisticated process of taxing land differently, so that state investment in that land was in some sense repaid down the line when land values are enhanced by the process of infrastructure investment. Now, at the moment in the United Kingdom, those processes of value capture do not exist legislatively. It does not take much to imagine ways in which they might work differently from the way they do now. There is a continual debate between the different parties who want to control the planning mitigation process, the planning gain, as you described earlier on, about for whose benefit the planning gain should work. And I think, personally, I think what needs to be done is that some of this needs to be just unpacked and put on the table to see realistically what is or is not possible. Part of what was implicit in what I was trying to say earlier on, and I think Ann Power has actually done some quite good work on this, is that some of the ways in which we might envisage a more successful way of changing the city is that, crudely, rather than having somewhere like the Thames Gateway turned into a kind of Beckton-like suburban model all the way across the east of London, we might actually try and think through and campaign for a higher quality of city, which will be partly about generating greater value from plots of land, in the full knowledge that the generation of greater value will extract greater mitigation, which will generate greater contributions towards social infrastructure, greater quality public realm, and a higher quality of city, notwithstanding the fact that that is all within a kind of realistic political economy. So part and parcel of what I'm trying to argue is that if you actually begin to get away from a kind of, if you like, pre-Foucauldian model of the state, civil society, community, all of these kind of entities separated out one from another, and begin to think through the ways in which all of these processes are implicated in regimes of negotiation and discussion and commodification of value, that's a way of opening up different kinds of future and different kinds of city. But what I was trying to think when I was trying to explain what I was going to say today is it becomes very difficult to kind of talk about this in the abstract, because what I would argue is that this applies as much to New York or to Shanghai as it does to London, even though the framing of both the political system and the economic system may be very different in those two contexts, because it is always about the interface of the generation of economic value and regimes of political power, and how those things are realized in the built form. And that's part of what I was trying to suggest is important about thinking through the future of cities differently.
Yes.
mean, answering those questions second, third, first, if you like, because they're in that order of easiness. I mean, I was not saying that people having access to housing resources across the city is a bad thing. I think it is. I think it, in the past, and I've carried out work on this. One of the things that the GLC did in access to estates was in the name of privileging the local community. It quite often allowed local communities to have a say in who was allocated property on their own estates. Now, this led to, in one of the estates that we're working on currently, this led to an incredible history in one specific estate where basically the GLC estate within a very multicultural area, oddly enough, remained white. Precisely because the way that community lettings worked was that people gave houses or allowed allocations to people of their own kind. So that trans-London mobility through a London-wide government sometimes had its own localised basis of allocation that was actually not so good. So, but the point I was trying to make is that if you think of London in its multicultural reality, the changing nature of eastern outer London and the emergence of black, Bengali, other minority ethnic communities in outer eastern London provides a real challenge to the way we think about the city, not least in terms of the kinds of future that will await the people who move to those areas and what we're going to do about it. That was the simple point I was trying to make. Not that people as a right shouldn't have access to that social good across the city as a whole, but the reality of multicultural on the ground challenges it. In terms of the third point, I think the skyline probably will change massively, and I think part of what I was trying to say is that I don't see, part of the tenor of what I was trying to say about the whole notion of social engineering and the city is precisely about that. I do not see the early decades of the 21st century being a return to some kind of 1945 situation. What I'm trying to say is that there is an inevitability, given the kind of ways in which London is figured as an economy, that certain kinds of change are occurring, and that there is an attempt to try to manage those changes, precisely because, as we know, with the collapsing infrastructure, the city doesn't work. Without certain forms of economic growth, the economy doesn't generate affluence, and without a public sector workforce, you're not going to be able to run your public services. So all of these things imply a different kind of political engagement with the city itself than was witnessed from kind of 1970 to the late 1990s. And I think that then feeds back to the first point, which is that without going into the kind of specifics of any one regime, this was one of the difficulties of trying to talk through these things, that in any struggle with private interest and public good, the public good is always continually defined, I think, within regimes of law, and what that means. And I think this is true. This would be true in Coin Street. I think it would be true in various other campaigns in central London. Is that the advantage of community campaigns is that they don't necessarily have to pay heed to the legal structures that actually bind some other parties that are part and parcel of those same processes of change. And I think one of the things that is constantly the case in my political life is being subjected, on the one hand, to community demands that will say the legislative authorities will sell out easily. People of good faith working inside the town hall worried that they will go too far and be exposed professionally for breaking the law, and communities on the ground who sometimes will say, you mustn't sell out, you mustn't sell out, you mustn't sell out, but then will determine their own price or their own value of selling out themselves within those negotiations. So there is whichever way the histories are told, I think there is a complex web of interests that determine, what are the ways through which property capital realises change in the physical fabric of the city, and the ways in which the value that is generated through that process is dispersed either through private shareholders or through the generation of public good, or through, whether that, very crudely, if you look at the Convoy site, one of the key issues down there is that there is a listed wharf. If you take the listed wharf and protect the listed wharf, then the value of the site diminishes. If the value of the site diminishes, the amount of community planning gain also diminishes. And there's a real contest there between those people who want to see the wharf itself protected indefinitely, and those who wish to see the maximisation of local planning gain or mitigation in that sense. So there are these kinds of debates that are going to be ongoing in every single situation. The point I was trying to make is that what it demands in terms of thinking through the ways cities change, it is an understanding of the ways in which regimes of governmental power interface with forces of economic change. That's a more simple point I was trying.
Michael, I'd like to thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge, and it's been a very great pleasure to have you with us. Thanks very much.